So biomedical engineers like myself are thank you, that's what I want to hear. We're responsible for some of the most incredible technology that we use today. Everything from pacemakers to glucose meters to EpiPens when we need them, to even the simple Band-Aid. But biomedical research doesn't have a perfect history. Sure, it's often been groundbreaking. If you take, for example, the centrifugal force birthing apparatus, something that was patented in 1965 by a childless couple in an attempt to mimic some false information they got about elephant birthing practices. While there's so much good behind the design of this device, they intended it to be less painful for mothers, a good thing. They borrowed ideas from nature, which we often celebrate in medicine, and it's very creative, I guess. However, anybody who's ever seen a birth or has ridden a spinning ride knows that this isn't a good idea. How many people do you think had eyes on this design before it was submitted to a patent office? Even better, how did it get patented? Well, unfortunately, that process only requires 3 things. It must be new, the submission must be non-obvious, and it must be useful. And although I personally might argue that this wasn't exactly useful, it did meet all of the criteria. Patented, but thankfully never actually built or implemented, this device is a clear example of what happens when we leave out a key stakeholder, the pregnant women, in designing something for them to use. The history of exclusion in medical research is abundant. And although that might have been a silly example, a more serious one includes research on women's contraceptives done in Puerto Rico in the 1950s. Now, I got to research this a lot because I was just there last week and looked around at the faces of the women who potentially were affected by these research trials. Researchers decided that if uneducated women in Puerto Rico could successfully take this birth control medication, then apparently anybody could do it. However, they didn't communicate the risks. They didn't communicate that this was an experimental process. They never gained proper informed consent, and they leveraged this vulnerable population. These drugs led to severe side effects and often led to infertility. But it was never addressed by these researchers. Instead, they simply lowered the dose that they were using and marketed it to women in the continental United States. And they never looked back. Medical research isn't alone in failing to extend a seat at the table. The truth is, if we're not intentional in giving equal access to our table, we are unintentionally exclusive. Being intentional in the products, the spaces, and the experiences that we design goes beyond thinking about what the other people might want to participate in or might want to have involved. It really requires including them in the conversation as you're designing these ideas or these projects. Now, growing up as a kid in Kansas, my table usually looked a lot like me. An example of 8 of my friends who all look identical to me, right? I remember when I filled out my first landscape canvas, which is something that each of you has done, and I had to go out and do these interviews with different people. And I started to realize that it wasn't just that they had different opinions or different ideas, but they had drastically different experiences, drastically different challenges, and drastically different questions that they wanted answered and they wanted to try to solve. These were things that I would have never considered because I was only surrounded by people who looked like me. The tip of the iceberg, this propelled me to begin recognizing areas where my table looked and felt a little too much like me. The new tables I began to build weren't always comfortable. They required me to be vulnerable about my weaknesses, about my blind spots, but they allowed me to recognize the differences that exist in the lived human experience that I was otherwise completely unaware of. I started teaching inclusive design practices, or the idea that we have to consider the full lived human experience in the work that we do to first-year biomedical engineering students 4 years ago. Watching their eyes get big when I talk about some of this atrocious history in our research field, I realized I wasn't the only one who was used to sitting at tables that looked too much like me. Over time, I've watched these students build a diverse community in their research teams and in their design teams. They have talked to staff who would work with the devices that they're designing in their junior and senior design courses. They've talked to the end user and their primary stakeholders to understand what the problem that they're trying to solve is really like for the person who needs it solved. The stories, the experiences, and the ideas that you bring to the table build a foundation to advance beyond the exclusion of the past. Unlike the engineers and the researchers who really only viewed scientific advancement through their own biases, by working together with people who aren't like us, we can be better designers, better engineers, and we can build more inclusive futures in everything that we do. We need each of you at our table. And because this table isn't like pie, we're not gonna run out of it, there's room for each one of you at this table, whether you're from a different country, whether you're from a place that speaks a different native language, whether you're from a different racial background, different religious belief, have any sort of visible or invisible disability, have different political beliefs, maybe part of the LGBTQ community, study different things, have different goals, different dreams, different desires, maybe a first-generation student. We need each one of you and everything in between to be a part of our table. So I invite you today to not only join our table, but to look around you. Look at all of these amazing fellows that you're gonna be spending the next week with and build a table that looks a little bit like ours.